I lost my wedding, and my cousin. Rachel had always considered herself ordinary in the best possible way. A second-grade teacher in a small town where people still returned borrowed pie pans and left casseroles on doorsteps after surgeries. She had built a life around simplicity and kindness. She wore soft colors, knew the names of all her neighbors' pets, and made a habit of leaving handwritten notes in her students' backpacks when they had hard days. Her world was small but warm, a slow-burning candle in a world obsessed with neon. She had always been close to her family. Sunday dinners at Grandma Jo's house were sacred. Chicken pot pie, sweet tea, stories that had been told so many times they'd become muscle memory. And Kayla, her cousin but more like a sister, had always been there. The younger, shinier echo of Rachel's steadiness. Kayla was sparkly where Rachel was grounded, impulsive where Rachel was thoughtful. They had grown up sharing everything: clothes, secrets, bedrooms during family reunions. And now, apparently, a man, Matt, had come into Rachel's life when they were both 19, sitting in a required freshman seminar on media literacy. He had dark curls that never behaved, the quiet confidence of someone who read more than he spoke, and a dry sense of humor that made Rachel feel seen in a way few others ever had. They bonded over bad coffee and shared playlists. By junior year, they were inseparable. After graduation, they stayed in their college town while Matt launched a modest startup in educational tech and Rachel began teaching. He was never flashy, never the kind of man who posted declarations of love online or bought giant teddy bears on Valentine's Day. But he made her tea when she had a cold, folded her laundry with unmatched socks on purpose just to make her smile, and told her every few days, in his quiet voice, "I like being around your kind of quiet." They got engaged on a rainy Sunday afternoon, curled up in their shared apartment, both barefoot. The ring was simple, vintage, and perfect. Rachel cried, not because it was a surprise. She had known since the second year they were together that he was her home, but because she was finally getting the life she had always imagined. Small, steady, safe. Kayla had helped plan the engagement party. She'd insisted on baking the cake herself, even though she was notorious for overbaking everything. Rachel didn't mind. She thought it was sweet. Kayla had always been eager to be included, to be the center of things, and Rachel never begrudged her that. She assumed Kayla's compliments about Matt were just Kayla being Kayla. "He's so deep," she said once with a wink. "Like, broody hot, you know." Rachel had laughed. It was the Christmas after their engagement when it all cracked open. They had returned to Rachel's hometown for the holidays. Her parents' house was full of the usual chaos, kids running through the halls, casseroles covering every surface, snow boots dripping near the door. Rachel had left her and Matt's bags in the guest room and gone downstairs to help Grandma Jo with the sweet potato pie. Matt stayed upstairs to finish an email. Or so he'd said. Later that night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She remembered Matt had left his iPad in the living room, and she thought she'd pull up a movie to lull herself into rest. The iPad wasn't password protected. She wasn't snooping, not really, that's what she told herself later. But when she opened the home screen, a message popped up, one of those preview bubbles that gives just enough to gut you. "Last night was dangerous. I still smell like you. Your room or mine tomorrow?" Followed by a peach emoji and a fire. The contact name was just K. It was the emoji that did it. That stupid, smug peach. Rachel clicked the thread. She didn't breathe for 10 minutes. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It was months, texts, photos, memories made in shadows. And the kicker, they had started while Kayla was helping Rachel plan her wedding. Rachel didn't scream, she didn't throw things. She walked to the kitchen, placed the iPad on the counter, and stared out the window until dawn began to touch the edge of the sky. She confronted Matt first. He stammered, pale and shaking, trying to reach for her hand across the kitchen table. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just, we connected. I thought it was just a mistake at first." But then, she stood up and left the room. Kayla came to her the next day, puffy-eyed and theatrical. I swear it was never about stealing him from you. She sobbed. We were both so lost. It was a moment of weakness. Please, Rach, you're stronger than this. We're family. That word, family, it felt like ash in Rachel's mouth. The rest of the relatives responded in degrees of awkward silence and diluted sympathy. Some asked her to reconsider. For the sake of peace. For grandma. For tradition. Her own mother, usually her fierce protector, had said, he was wrong. Yes, but are you sure this is worth burning bridges? Rachel packed her things and drove back to her apartment in the city without saying goodbye. The wedding was called off. The ring was mailed back in a padded envelope with no note. Matt moved out within the week. The silence afterward was cavernous. Not just from him, but from the people she had expected to stand beside her. She waited for someone, anyone, to say, you were wronged. You deserved better. No one did. Even Grandma Jo's voice, once so steady in Rachel's mind, seemed distant, as if grief had too many frequencies to hold them all at once. Rachel returned to her classroom, but the joy had gone quiet. She found herself pausing mid-sentence, forgetting what lesson she was teaching. She couldn't look at her students without wondering what it would feel like to raise a child in a world where betrayal looked like peach emojis sent from your cousin. After 2 weeks, she filed for extended leave. She turned off her phone. She let the dishes pile in the sink. And for the first time in her life, Rachel no longer wanted to go home. The home she had known was gone. But something else, something unnamed, was waiting in the soil. It would take time to find it. But it was there, buried, quiet, still breathing. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was realizing no one stood up for me. Rachel didn't leave her bed the day after she returned home. Or the next. Or the day after that. What began as exhaustion quickly calcified into a kind of inertia. She wasn't crying anymore. That would have required energy. Instead, she stared at the ceiling for hours, watched dust float in the air, and listened to her own breath like it belonged to someone else. When she slept, her dreams came in static. When she ate, it was out of necessity, not hunger. The apartment dimmed around her. Plants she once pruned with care began to brown. Dishes became relics in the sink. The teacher in her, the organized, compassionate, dependable Rachel, began to fade like a watercolor left in the sun. She called the school district and requested an extended leave of absence. Her principal, Mrs. Kwan, left 2 voicemails in concern. Rachel never returned them. The holidays passed without acknowledgement. No decorations, no dinners. Her birthday came and went with 2 texts, one from an old college roommate, one from a cousin who hadn't heard the news yet. She ignored them both. The family didn't press. They had made their choice, or rather, their silence had. Rachel could have forgiven a betrayal. What she couldn't forgive was the suggestion that her boundaries were the real problem. It wasn't Matt's abandonment that broke her. It wasn't even Kayla's betrayal. It was that no one told her she was right to walk away. That no one said, "We choose you." Loneliness, when paired with betrayal, doesn't just hurt, it unroots you. Weeks turned into months. Rachel's world shrank to the radius of her bedroom, her bathroom, and the fridge. She lived in leggings and oversized hoodies, each day indistinguishable from the last. People stopped calling. Friends faded, unsure what to say. There were no interventions, just a slow fade-out, like the last scene of a movie no one stays to watch. Then came the lawn. It was early spring, the first true sunlight in weeks. Rachel opened the back door intending to dump the kitchen trash and saw it, the overgrown yard. Dandelions rising like tiny rebellions. Weeds curling over the flower beds her grandmother once tended with military precision. Rachel stood there, still in her socks, squinting into the light. Something cracked. Not a dramatic breakdown, just a quiet ache that surfaced in the back of her throat. She walked out, barefoot, and pulled at a patch of clover that had overtaken the marigolds. Her hands hit cold, damp soil. The contact startled her. She knelt, and for the first time in months, she cried. Not silent tears, but full, shaking sobs, the kind that come from the stomach. She cried for the wedding that never happened, for the cousin who didn't say sorry, for the grandmother who would have been the only one to sit beside her in bed without asking questions. When the crying stopped, she was still kneeling in the dirt, her hands filthy, her cheeks wet, and for the first time since it all unraveled, Rachel felt something shift, not hope, not clarity, just movement. She began going outside a little each day. No plan, no pressure, just pulling weeds, rearranging stones, brushing leaves off the garden bench. One morning, she opened her laptop and typed, "Community gardening classes near me." There was one, just 15 minutes away. Saturday mornings, soil, compost, climate balance, basic horticulture. She didn't overthink it. She signed up. The first class was awkward. Rachel sat in the back. She hadn't worn makeup in months and didn't plan to. Her nails were short and cracked. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. But no one looked twice. People came for the soil, not the stories. The instructor introduced himself as James, 35, with sun-worn hands and a gentle way of walking, as if he didn't want to disturb the earth under his boots. He explained irrigation systems like he was telling bedtime stories. There was a scar above his eyebrow and a ring tan on his finger, though the ring itself was gone. During a break, Rachel wandered near the potted fruit trees. James stood nearby, misting a lemon sapling. "Yours?" she asked. He smiled. "Most of them, but they're stubborn. You have to listen before you start fixing." Rachel tilted her head. "Trees talk to you, more than people, sometimes." She smiled. It surprised her. They didn't exchange numbers, or life stories, but over the next few weeks, she learned he was a widower. His wife had died 2 years earlier, car accident. Sudden, no goodbye. He never said her name. Rachel never asked. They repotted seedlings side by side, shared coffee in travel mugs, swapped gardening gloves once by accident. James never tried to make her smile, never asked why her eyes looked tired. He spoke with a quiet kindness, one that didn't intrude. It was his presence that healed, like shade after too much sun. Rachel began to sleep again. Not well, but enough. She started composting at home, resurrected her grandmother's forgotten flowerbeds. For the first time, she remembered what it felt like to anticipate tomorrow. She didn't talk about Matt, or Kayla, or the email that ruined everything. And James never asked. Sometimes healing doesn't look like epiphanies. Sometimes it looks like dirt under your fingernails. The weight of a watering can. The rustle of basil leaves in morning light. Rachel was still broken, but at least now, something was growing. He didn't try to fix me. He just gave me space to grow. The conversations started with soil. It was safer that way. Safe to talk about texture and drainage, nitrogen levels, when to water and when to wait. Rachel liked how James explained things, not in bullet points or absolutes, but in metaphors, like how compost was proof that even rot could be transformed into nourishment, or how light was most useful when it filtered in softly, not all at once. He never asked personal questions, not right away. She didn't volunteer much either, but healing has a way of loosening the tongue, like a knot slowly unfurling in warm water. It was during a quiet morning tending to the squash beds that Rachel mentioned her grandmother for the first time. She used to plant by the moon, she said, brushing dirt from her gloves. James looked up. "Lunar cycles?" "Yeah," said the earth listened better then. I don't know if it was science or just her own rhythm. But everything she grew tasted like magic. He smiled. "Sounds like someone who understood time." That became a theme between them. Time, not as something to fill, but something to trust. James talked about his wife one afternoon while pruning fig branches. Rachel hadn't expected it. He just said, she painted ceilings, murals, rooms that looked like the inside of dreams. Rachel waited. She was driving back from a project when it happened. Rainy night. They said she didn't suffer. I hate that phrase. It implies that absence is mercy. He didn't cry. He didn't look away, just kept pruning. Rachel didn't offer platitudes, just sat beside him, hands still, breathing steady. A week later, she told him about Matt. Not all of it, not at once, just pieces. A story told sideways, a cousin, a wedding that didn't happen, a silence from people who should have screamed with her. When she said Kayla's name, James didn't flinch. He just asked, "Do you still hurt?" Rachel thought about it. "Sometimes. Mostly when I think about how easily I disappeared from their lives." He nodded. "Sometimes we have to vanish so we can finally see who was only looking at us when we stood in the light." They spent more and more time together after that. It wasn't dating. There were no official steps. Just presence, help, coffee, shared gloves, quiet inside jokes. One evening, he brought over an old hand tiller to help her reclaim the side garden of her grandparents' house, which had sat untouched since Joe passed. "This place has good bones," he said, testing the soil. Rachel crouched beside him, pulling up old crabgrass. "She used to grow beans here. I think the roots might still be alive underneath." James touched the soil. "Then we start slow, root by root." They spent weekends clearing, turning, amending. He taught her about compost tea. She showed him how to braid tomato vines through trellises. They started a small community box where neighbors could pick their own herbs. Children wandered in with curiosity. One little boy asked if they were married. Rachel flushed. James just smiled and said, "Not yet." It was late autumn when James asked her. They were harvesting cherry tomatoes in the golden hour light. The vines had gone wild with the last burst of warmth before the cold. Rachel wore an old sweater that smelled faintly of basil. James held out a small wooden crate and asked, casually, as if it had always been waiting inside the silence, "What do you think about growing something a little more permanent, together?" Rachel didn't freeze. She didn't cry. She just smiled, tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, and said, "Let's start with something that needs full sun." They married in the spring. No aisle, no veil, just a trellis covered in bougainvillea. Friends standing in a circle, and Rachel's bare feet on the soil her grandmother once knelt in. She wore a dress the color of sage. James wore suspenders and a crooked boutonniere made of lavender. There was no first dance. Just laughter, a guitar strumming in the background. Hands covered in flour from the communal dinner they cooked together. Someone brought peach cobbler. Rachel took seconds. They didn't post anything, no announcements, no hashtags. It was a wedding made of earth and time and hands that knew how to hold gently. That night, sitting on the garden bench with her legs across James's lap, Rachel looked up at the moon and whispered to no one in particular, "It turns out you can grow new roots, even in a place that once buried you." James kissed her shoulder, and the wind rustled through the lemon trees like a blessing. Rachel wasn't healed, but she was rooted, and this time, she wasn't alone. "I went to bury someone. I didn't expect to bury the past." Rachel hadn't stepped foot in her hometown in nearly 3 years. Not since the incident that had rewired her entire sense of belonging. Not since she'd returned to find silence where loyalty should have been. But when her mother called and said, simply, "It's Grandma Jo, she's gone," Rachel knew she would go. There was no hesitation, just the kind of grief that moves quietly through the ribcage, collecting itself like fog. James offered to come with her without needing to be asked. By now he had become more than a husband. He was her anchor, her echo, her evidence that starting again was not only possible, but sometimes more true than anything that came before. They packed light. The trip would be 2 days. Just enough time to honor Jo, stand in her garden, and leave before old ghosts found new ways to breathe. The town hadn't changed. The stoplight still flickered longer than it should. The bakery still had the same crooked A in its sign. But the way people looked at Rachel had. She had cut her hair since anyone had last seen her. It was now short, deliberate, framed her jaw with elegance. Her clothes were simple but structured. No more pastel cardigans or soft, apologetic colors. She wore deep green, the color of living things that had survived winter. And then there was James. 6'1", rolled up sleeves, calloused hands, and a presence that didn't demand attention, but made people straighten their posture when he walked by. He wasn't just the man beside her. He was the man who matched her silence, met her strength. They arrived at the funeral home 15 minutes early. Rachel took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, her heels crunching on the gravel. James reached over, adjusted the sleeve of her coat, and whispered, "I've got you." She didn't need rescuing, but it mattered that he knew that and showed up anyway. Inside, the room was filled with hydrangeas and murmurs. Joe's photo, an old one where her lipstick was too red and her eyes too kind, sat next to the urn. Framed in gold, Rachel placed a hand on the frame. "Just for a second," she whispered, "you'd love him." Then the air changed. She felt it before she saw them. That subtle hush that falls across a room not because someone important entered, but because someone complicated did. Kayla walked in, dressed like grief had to be fashionable. Black fitted dress, heels too high for a cemetery, makeup flawless. She held the arm of the man beside her like a prop. Matt. He looked thinner. The confident slouch she remembered had turned into a kind of guarded stiffness. His tie was askew, his smile practiced. They stood at the entrance, scanning the room, and then their eyes found her. Rachel didn't flinch. She stood taller. Matt blinked rapidly. Kayla froze, her mouth parting just slightly. But it wasn't Rachel that truly undid her. It was James. He stepped forward gently, placing a hand on the small of Rachel's back as they turned to greet family members. His posture was natural, but his presence was definitive. Ownership without possession, support without dominance. Someone from the extended family, a great-aunt or maybe a cousin's wife, leaned in and whispered, "Rachel, you look different, radiant." Rachel smiled. "I feel different." There was no formal confrontation, no dramatic gasps, but the tension threaded the air like a string pulled tight. Matt and Kayla stayed on the opposite side of the room, pretending to be consumed in conversation. But Rachel caught them glancing, again, and again, during the graveside service, as the pastor spoke about roots and legacy. Rachel watched Kayla shift uncomfortably in her stilettos. The wind picked up, a leaf flew across the casket. James reached down and tucked Rachel's hair behind her ear. She didn't need the gesture, but she let it happen. After the ceremony, there was a short reception at Joe's house, now mostly empty. Soon to be sold. Rachel and James stood by the back door, sipping lemonade and avoiding centerpieces. The hydrangeas in the yard was still bare, but she knew they'd bloom soon. That's when Matt approached. Not Kayla, just him. He walked like a man trying to seem casual but with 1,000 calculations per step. "Rachel," he said. She looked up. "Matt." He glanced at James, then back. "I didn't know you'd be here." "She was my grandmother." "Of course. He didn't finish. James extended a hand, polite but firm. "James Carter." Matt hesitated, then shook it. "Matt Olson." There was a flicker of recognition. Rachel watched the moment land. "You're with Carter Agriculture?" Matt asked. James nodded. "Founder and CEO." A pause. Matt's expression faltered for the first time. "I applied there last month." Rachel didn't blink. "I know." He didn't ask how. He knew. A beat passed. Then James said, "We keep records." Matt cleared his throat. "Well, best of luck with the crops." He turned, walked off. Kayla watched from the porch, her posture rigid, eyes wide. She mouthed something Rachel couldn't read. Rachel didn't respond. She turned back to James. "Let's go home soon," she said. He nodded. But before they left, she walked through Joe's garden one last time. The rosemary still grew by the fence. The dirt smelled like memory. James stood at the gate, waiting. Rachel turned once, looked back at the house, and exhaled. She had come to bury her grandmother. But somehow, she'd buried something else too. And this time, she was the one walking away first. She thought she'd ruined me, but she only made room for better things to grow. The guests were beginning to thin out, drifting toward cars parked along the crooked country road. The late afternoon light had begun to shift, warmer now, casting long shadows across the lawn where folding chairs had been hurriedly stacked. The clink of dishes being cleared from the kitchen floated faintly through the cracked windows. Rachel stood just beyond the porch, by the old pear tree. Her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lemonade that had long since gone warm. James was inside, helping Rachel's mother pack the last of the casseroles into storage containers. Rachel had needed a moment, just a breath, one more inhale of her childhood before they drove back toward the life she had grown beyond. She had been watching a monarch butterfly circle the garden gate when she heard the footsteps. "I didn't want to leave without saying something," Kayla said behind her. Rachel didn't turn around, not immediately. Kayla stood a few feet away, wringing her hands, her heels sinking slightly into the soft spring grass. Her makeup, once flawless, had begun to soften under the weight of the day. Her voice was uneven. I needed to say I'm sorry," Kayla said, "for everything." Rachel let the silence linger, not out of cruelty, but because the moment deserved its weight. "I was young and insecure and—" Rachel turned to face her. "You were selfish," she said gently, not confused, not lost. "You wanted something that wasn't yours and you took it because you could." Kayla blinked. Tears threatened, but didn't fall. "Are you okay now?" Rachel studied her for a moment. Then she smiled. "I'm not just okay," she said, "I'm living the kind of life you never had the patience to plant." Kayla's breath caught. She looked past Rachel, through the open door where James stood, laughing softly with Rachel's uncle, his hand holding a casserole lid with the ease of a man who belonged. Her eyes softened, then dropped to the ground. She said nothing else. Rachel nodded once, then stepped past her and back onto the porch. She didn't look back. James met her with a glance, read her posture, and said nothing, just handed her the car keys. They drove home in companionable silence, the sun setting behind them, casting orange against the rearview mirror. James played old jazz on the radio, the kind that meandered without asking for attention. Rachel rested her head against the window. Back at home, she kicked off her shoes and walked straight to the garden. The moon was low but bright, and the air smelled like damp earth. James followed her with 2 mugs of tea. The rows were clean, the soil turned, the seedlings beginning to peek out like green punctuation marks in a sentence that had only just begun. Rachel crouched by the mustard greens. The leaves trembled slightly in the breeze. "These made it through the frost," she murmured. James knelt beside her. "Because you covered them just enough. Not too much." She smiled, slipped on the warm gardening gloves she'd used every season since her first planting. They were frayed now, especially around the thumb, but still held their shape. Still held her. She ran her gloved hands through the soil, grounding herself. "She thought she'd ruined me," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the wind. "But she only cleared space. For this, for you, for this whole damn life." James rested his hand over hers. Said nothing. He didn't need to. They sat like that for a long time. 2 people shaped by loss, stitched back together by time, soil, and silence. Rachel looked up at the stars and felt nothing pulling her backward anymore. "She took what I thought I needed," she whispered. "But it turns out, life had something better growing just beneath the surface."